Chapter 5, Subtle Threads. All you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. Blake, as always quoted by Neville Goddard. Nothing appears or continues in being by a power of its own. Events happen because comparatively stable imaginal activities created them, and they continue in being by virtue of the support they receive from such imaginal activities. The part which imagining the wish fulfilled plays in consciously creating circumstances is obvious in this series of stories. You will see how the telling of one story of the successful use of the imagination can serve as a spur and a challenge to others to try it and see. One night, a gentleman rose in my audience. He said that he had no question asked, but would like to tell me something. This was his story. When he came out of the armed forces after World War II, he got a job that gave him take-home pay of $25 a week. After 10 years, he was making $600 a month. At the time, he bought my book, Awaken Imagination, and read the chapter, The Pruning Shears of Revision. Through the daily practice of revision as set forth there, he was able to tell my audience 2 years later that his income was equal to that of the President of the United States. In my audience sat a man who, by his confession, was broke. He had read the same book, but he suddenly realized he had done nothing with the use of his imagination to solve his financial problem. All right. He decided he would try to imagine himself as the winner of the 5-10 pool at Caliente racetrack. In his words, in this pool, one attempts to pick winners in the 5th through the 10th races. So this is what I did. In my imagination, I stood sorting my tickets and feeling as I did so that I had each of the 6 winners. I enacted this scene over and over in my imagination until I actually felt goose pimples. Then I saw the cashier giving me a large sum of money, which I placed beneath my imaginary shirt. This was my entire imaginal drama, and for 3 weeks, night after night, I enacted the scene and fell asleep in this action. After 3 weeks, I traveled physically to Caliente racetrack, and on that very day, detail of my imaginative play was actually realized. The only change in the scene was the cashier gave me a check for a total of $84,000 instead of currency. TK. Wow. After my lecture night, this story was told. A man in the audience asked me if I thought it possible for him to duplicate TK's experience. I told him he must decide the circumstances of his imaginal scene himself, but that whatever scene he chose, he must create a drama he could make natural to himself and imagine intently with all the feeling that he could muster. He must not labor for the means to the end, but live imaginatively in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. 1 month later, he showed me a check for $16,000, which he had won in another 5-10 pool at the same Caliente racetrack the previous day. This man had a sequel to his most interesting duplication of TK's good fortune. His first win took care of his immediate financial difficulties, although he wanted more money for future family security. Also, and more important to him, he wanted to prove that this had not been an accident. He reasoned that if his good luck could happen a second time in succession, the so-called law of percentages would give way to proof for him that his imaginal structures were actually producing the miraculous reality. And so he dared to put his imagination to a second test. He continues, I wanted a sizable bank account, and this to me meant seeing a large balance on my bank statements. Therefore, in my imagination, I enacted a scene which took me into 2 banks. In each bank, I would see an appreciative smile meant for me from the bank manager, and as I walked into his establishment, and I would hear the teller's cordial greeting. I would ask to see my statement. In one bank, I saw a balance of $10,000. In the other, I saw a balance of $15,000. My imaginal scene did not end there. Immediately after seeing my bank balances, I would turn my attention to my horse racing system, which, through a progression of 10 steps, would bring my winnings to $11,533 with a starting capital of $200. I would divide the winnings into 12 piles on my desk. Counting the money in my imaginary hands, I would put $1,000 in each of the 11 piles, and the remaining $533 in the last pile. My imaginative accounting would amount to the $36,533, including in my bank balances. Including my bank balances. I enacted this entire imaginative scene each morning, afternoon, and night for less than 1 month, and on March 2nd, I went to the Caliente racetrack again. I made out my tickets, but strangely enough, and not knowing why I did so, I duplicated 6 more tickets exactly like the 6 already made out, but in the 10th selection, I made a mistake and copied 2 tickets twice. As the winners came in, I held 2 of them each paying $16,423.50. I also had 6 consolation tickets, or consolation tickets, each paying $656.80. The combined total amounted to $36,788. My imaginary accounting 1 month before had totaled $36,533. 2 points of interest most profound to me were that my seeming accident, I had marked 2 winning tickets identically, and also that in the end of the 9th race, which was one of the major winners, the trainer attempted to scratch the horse, but the stewards denied the trainer's request. AGF, or I should say AJF. How subtle were the threads that led to this goal? Results must testify to our imagining, or we really are not imagining the end at all. AJF faithfully imagined the end, and all things conspired to aid his harvesting. His mistake in copying a winning ticket twice, and the steward's refusal to allow the trainer's request were events created by the imaginal drama to move the plan of things forward to its goal. Chance, wrote Belford Bax, may be defined as that element in the reality change that is in the flowing synthesis of events, which is irreducible to law or the causal category. To live wisely, we must be aware of our imaginal activities, or at any rate of the end which they are tending. We must see to it that it is the end we desire. Wise imagining identifies itself only with such activities that are of value or promise well. However much man seems to be dealing with a material world, he is actually living in a world of imagination. When he discovers that it is not the physical world of facts, but imaginal activities which shape his life, then the physical world will no longer be the reality, and the world of imagination no longer the dream. Does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Will the day's journey take the whole long day? From morn to night, my friend. Christina Georgina Rossetti, Uphill. Chapter 6. Visionary fancy. The nature of visionary fancy or imagination is very little known. The external nature and permanence of its ever-existent images is considered as less permanent than the things of vegetative and generative nature. Yet the oak dies as well as the lettuce, but its eternal image and individuality never dies, but renews by its seed. Just so the imaginative image returns by the seed of contemplative thought. Blake. The images of our imagination are the realities of which any physical manifestation is only the shadow. If we are faithful to vision, the image will create for itself the only physical manifestation of itself it has a right to make. We speak of the reality of a thing when we mean its material substance. That is exactly what an imaginist means by its unreality or shadow. Imagining is spiritual sensation. Enter into the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Through spiritual sensation, through use of imaginal sight, sound, scent, taste, and touch, you will give to your image the sensory vividness necessary to produce that image in your outer or shadow world. Here's the story of one who was faithful to his vision. F.B. Being a true imaginist, remember what he had heard in his imagination. Thus he writes, a friend who knows my passionate fondness for opera tried to get Kirsten Flagstad's complete recording of Tristan and Isolde for me at Christmas. In over a dozen record stores, he was told the same thing. RCA Victor is not reissuing this recording, and there have been no copies made since June. On December 27th, I determined to prove your principle again by getting the album I desired so intensely. Lying down in my living room, I mentally walked into a record shop I patronized, and I asked the one salesman whose face and voice I could recall, do you have the Flagstad's complete Isolde? He replied, yes, I have. That ended the scene, and I repeated it until it was real to me. Late that afternoon, I went to the record shop to physically enact the scene. No one detail supplied by the senses had encouraged me to believe I could walk out of that shop with those records. I had been told last September by the same salesman in the same shop the same story my friend had received there before Christmas. Approaching the salesman I had seen in my imagination that morning, I said, do you have Flagstad's complete Isolde? He replied, no, we haven't. Without saying anything audible to him, I said inwardly, that's not what I heard you say. As I turned to leave the shop, I noticed on top of a shelf that I thought to be an advertisement of this set of records, and remarked to the salesman, if you don't have the merchandise, you shouldn't advertise it. That's right, he replied, and he reached up to take it down, discovered it to be a complete album with all 5 records. The scene wasn't played exactly as I had constructed it, but the result confirmed that what I had imagined and what my scene implied. How can I thank you? F.B. After reading F.B.'s letter, we must agree with Anthony E. Eden that An assumption, though false, if persistent in, will harden into fact. FB's fancy, fusing with the sense field of the record shop, enriched aspects of it and made them his, what he perceived. Our future is our imagining in its creative march. FB used his imagination for a conscious purpose, representing life as he desired it to be, and thereby affecting life instead of merely reflecting it. So sure was he that his imaginal drama was the reality and the physical act but a shadow. But when the salesman said, "No, we haven't," FB mentally said, "That's not what I heard you say." He not only remembered what he had heard, but he was still remembering it. Imagining the wish fulfilled is the seeking that finds, the asking that receives, the knocking to which is open. He saw and heard what he desired to see and hear, and would not take no for an answer. The imaginist dreams while awake. He is not the servant of his vision, but the master of the direction of his attention. Imaginative constancy controls perception of events in space-time. Unfortunately, most men are ever-changing, like a joyless eye that finds no object worth its constancy. Percy Blythe Shelley, To the Moon. Mrs. G.R. too had imaginally heard that what she wanted to physically hear, and knew the outer world must confirm it. This is her story. Some time ago, we've advertised our home for sale, which was necessary for us to buy a larger property on which we had placed a deposit. Several people would have bought our home immediately, but were obliged to explain that we could not close any deal until we learned whether or not our offer for the property we wanted had been accepted. At this time, a broker called and literally begged us to allow him to show our home to a client of his who was eager for this location and would be glad to pay even more than we were asking. We explained our situation to the broker and to his client. They both stated they did not mind waiting for our deal to be consummated. The broker asked us to sign a paper which he said was not binding in any way, but would give him first chance at the sale if our other deal went through. We signed the paper and later learned in California real estate law nothing could have been more binding. A few days later, our deal for the new property fell through, so we notified this broker, and his verbal response was, well, just forget it. 2 weeks later, he filed a suit against us for $1,500 commission. Trial date was set, and we asked for a jury trial. Our attorney assured us he would do all he could, but that the law on this particular point was so stringent that he could not see any possibility of our winning the case. When time for the trial arrived, my husband was in the hospital and could not appear with me in our defense. I had no witnesses, but the broker brought 3 attorneys and a number of witnesses into court against us. Our attorney now told me we had not the slightest chance to win. Well, guess what she did? She turned her imagination, and this is what I did, completely disregarding all that had been said by attorneys, witnesses, and the judge, who seemed to favor the plaintiff. I thought only of the words I wanted to hear. In my imagination, I listened intently and heard the foreman of the jury say, "We find the defendant not guilty." I listened until I knew it was true. I closed my mind's ear to everything said in the courtroom. Again, I closed my mind's ear to everything said in that courtroom and heard only those words, "We find the defendant not guilty." The jury deliberated from noon recess until 4:30 that afternoon, and all during those hours I sat in the courtroom and heard those words over and over in my imagination. When the jury, she just said that she said it over and over again in her imagination. You talk about a robotic affirmation. When the jurors returned, the judge asked the foreman to stand and give their verdict. The foreman stood up and said, "We find the defendant not guilty." Mrs. G.R. If there were dreams to sell, what would you buy? Thomas Lovell Bedos, Dream Peddlery. Would you not buy your wish fulfilled? Your dreams are without price and without money. By locking up the jury in her imagination, hearing only what she wanted to hear, she called the jury to unanimity on her behalf. Imagining being the reality of all that exists, with it, the lady achieved her wish fulfilled. Hebel's statement that the poet creates from contemplation is true of imaginists as well. They know how to realize their video-audio hallucinations to create reality. Nothing is so fatal as conformity. We must not allow ourselves to be girt about the ringed fixity of fact. Again, nothing is so fatal as conformity. We must not allow ourselves to be girt about by the ringed fixity of fact. Change the image and thereby change the fact. R.O. employed the art of seeing and feeling to create her vision and imagination. A year ago, I took my children to Europe, leaving my furnished apartment in the care of my maid. When we returned a few months later to the U.S., I found my maid and all my furniture gone. The apartment superintendent stated that the maid had my furniture moved by my request. There was nothing I could do at the moment, so I took my children and moved into a hotel. I, of course, reported the incident to the police, also brought in private detectives on the case. Both organizations investigated every moving company and every storage warehouse in New York City, but to no avail. There seemed to be absolutely no trace of my furniture nor of my maid. Having exhausted all outside sources, I remembered your teaching and decided I would try using my imagination in this matter. So while seated in my hotel room, I closed my eyes, imagined myself in my apartment, sitting in my favorite chair and surrounded by all of my personal furnishings. I looked across the living room at the piano in which I kept pictures of my children. I would continue to stare at my piano until the entire room became vividly real to me. I could see my children's pictures and actually feel the upholstery of the chair in which in my imagination I sat. The next day, as I came out of my bank, I turned to walk in the direction of my vacant apartment instead of toward my hotel. When I reached the corner, I discovered my mistake and was just about to turned back when my attention was drawn to a very familiar pair of ankles. Yes, the ankles belonged to my maid. I walked up to her and took her by the arm. She was quite frightened, but I assured her all I wanted from her was my furniture. I called a taxi, and she took me to the place in which her friends had stored my furnishings. In one day, my imagination found what an entire big city police force and private investigators could not find in weeks. R.O. This lady knew of the secret of imagining before she called in the police, but imagining, in spite of its importance, was forgotten, owing to attention being fixed on facts. However, what reason failed to find by force, imagining found without effort. Nothing merely goes on, including the sense of loss, without its imaginal support. By imagining that she was seated in her own chair in her own living room, surrounded by all of her furnishings, she withdrew the imaginal support she had given to her sense of loss, and by this imaginal change, she recovered her lost furniture and reestablished her home. Your imagination is most creative when you imagine things as you desire them to be, building a new experience out of dream of fancy. To build such a dream of fancy in her imagination, e.g. brought to play all her senses, sight, sound, touch, smell, even taste. This is her story. Since childhood, I have dreamed of visiting faraway places. The West Indies particularly fired my fancy, and I would revel in the feeling of actually being there. Dreams are wonderfully inexpensive, and as an adult, I continue to dream my dreams, for I had no money or time to make them come true. Last year, I was taken to the hospital in need of surgery. I had heard your teaching, and while recuperating, had decided to intensify my favorite daydream while I had time on my hands. I actually wrote to the Alcoa steamship line, asking for the free travel folders, and pored over them hour after hour, choosing the ship and the stateroom and the 7 ports I desired to most see. I would close my eyes, and in my imagination would walk up the gangplank of that ship and feel the movement of water as the great liner pushed its way into the free ocean. I heard the thud of the waves breaking against the sides of the ship, felt the steaming warmth of a tropical sun on my face, and smelled and tasted salt in the air as we sailed through the blue waters. Wow, it sounds familiar. It sounds like Neville as well. For one solid week, confined to a hospital bed, I lived the free and happy experience of actually being on that ship. Then the day before my release from the hospital, I tucked the colored folders away and forgot all about them. 2 months later, I received a telegram from an advertising agency telling me I'd won a contest. I remembered having deposited a contest coupon some months before in a neighborhood supermarket, but had completely forgotten the act. I had won first prize, and wonder of wonders, it entitled me to a Caribbean cruise sponsored by the Alcoa steamship line. Well, let's not forget, Neville was from the Caribbean, Barbados, and he frequently took the Alcoa steamship line. Wow, I'm sure he helped. But the wonder didn't stop there. The very stateroom I had imaginably lived in and moved about in while confined to a hospital bed had been assigned to me. And to make an unbelievable story even more unbelievable, I sailed on one ship I had chosen, which stopped in not one, but all of the 7 ports I desired to visit. FG.